Perfect. All right, let's get started then. So welcome everyone to the Awareness Festival. Thank you for being here today. The stands for Tourism, Hospitality and Events. And the team is made of Zach, Andy, and myself, Antia. The Awareness Festival will be taking place every Wednesday of October at 5 p.m., each week focused on a different topic. So next week will be hospitality, third week will be events, and last week will be focused on the student and new graduate perspective of the industry. This week we are discussing tourism, and we have our two guest speakers present. Thank you both for being here. Our first speaker is Professor Sally Everett. She is a professor of business education and vice dean of the King's College Business School of King's College in London. Between her many other qualifications, she has a PhD in tourism and sustainability, extensive experience in the educational sector, and is a published author. So thank you very much, Sally, for being here today.
My pleasure.
Our second guest speaker is Miriam Constantinou. Miriam is the general manager and content creator of Rutherford's Punting company, based here in Cambridge, and an ARU graduate. She has over 8 years of experience in management, training teams to achieve their best potential, as well as delivering always the highest possible standard in her roles. As a manager of Rutherford's, her experience in the tourism industry can offer us great insight on today's talk. So thank you very much for being here, Miriam.
My pleasure.
Just a quick reminder for everyone to please mute yourselves during the talk, and please save your questions for the end. Then you will have an opportunity to ask them to both speakers. So without further ado, Professor Everett, please go ahead.
Great. I'm going to share my screen in a minute, but just to say, obviously, I was Deputy Dean at ARU for a number of years, so you are still very close to my heart. So 3 years ago, I was there teaching tourism and various other things. And also, I'm hoping that Nikki, your tutor, has really given it a push, but obviously I would push the Guide to Tourism and Employability, which is a textbook that we've just produced, and I think partly what I've been asked to speak today. Absolute pleasure. Please call me Sally. Professor does sound very formal, although it's always nice to have as well. What I'm proposing to do is hopefully speak for, I think it's 15-20 minutes or so, probably the macro level in terms of looking at tourism, and then hopefully I think Miriam will give you a really important local context, what it actually means in terms of a local tourism business, which I'll be fascinated to hear as well, given that I've written a couple of things on Cambridge which were quite controversial in terms of whether we should introduce things like tourist taxes and such, which I think the BBC picked up on at one point, and various different newspapers. So lovely to meet you all. I'm going to, if it all goes well, it's just to share my screen. I can't necessarily see the chat and everything else, so I'm going to share a window here. Hopefully you can see that there. Otherwise you can shout if you can't see it. So really, hopefully it will draw on some kind of questions that you might have. As I said, I work for King's. I've been there 3 years. And although I am a professor of business education, my heart is really tourism. And I've worked in tourism for a number of years in marketing departments and various other things, particularly over at the SS Great Britain down in Bristol, which was a rusty old bucket until we spent about £20 million on it, and it became one of the biggest and most popular tourist attractions in the southwest. So catalyst for change or catastrophe in terms of COVID and its impact on tourism. And what I wanted to just really run through quickly with you are 3 things. Reflecting on the impact of the pandemic, as far as I can see, and as far as the research is telling us thus far. Thinking about how it might change the way we work and its role in creating, perhaps hopefully, more sustainable, environmentally conscious tourism alternatives, i.e. the catalyst for change, which I believe it is. Although it is catastrophic in so many different ways as well, and what this might mean for you as students, and I'd like to spend a bit of time. You'll see me jumping over the Giza, the pyramid at Giza there. I am a great lover of all things tourism, but this was my last overseas trip. It was for work, but it was just in the February before the lockdown, so I have very fond memories of enjoying a trip over to Egypt there. So these are familiar scenes. And really the first thing I wanted to do out of the 3 was really look at, how has it affected the tourism sector? I'm sure you've seen this. unlike, this is not the first crisis, obviously, the tourism sector has faced in terms of, tsunamis and earthquakes and terrorist activities, climate changes, health and safety concerns, the impact of refugees on tourist attractions, you name it. But obviously, it is the most significant for obvious and clear reasons. So just a couple of charts, really, just to highlight this, what I would call a quadruple threat. So here we have, and it varies depending on which UN WTO graphs and various things that you use, depending on what continents you're looking at. But here's an industry that has literally suffered possibly a 70, potentially 80% fall in its revenue and its arrivals. So really significant. So the quadruple threat being the decline in tourism and hospitality, an economic collapse that's been more dramatic than any previous year we've seen. The potential to cause fundamental modifications. What I mean is that it has been a catalyst for so many different things, and it has been a massive disruption to the tourism sector. Some will succeed and innovate out of it, some will not. And at the moment, okay, we're seeing travel, but there's still a number of red countries, there's still a number of countries that are not vaccinated, there are still a number of countries that have significant concerns and lockdowns, so the end is not in sight. At the moment. And it's interesting when you look at some of the research, actually, it's still quite early days, 2020, 21 research, but we can definitely see that this is going to take some time to recover from. So in terms of actually looking at some of the recovery rates or where countries expect to rebound in international tourism, 2022 potentially in terms of 60% thinking that it's going to take some time. I think we all feel the ramifications of this for a long time. There's a quote here. The pandemic has decimated an $8 trillion global dollar global travel industry overnight. Various different things, open borders, open destinations, visa-free travel, things that we perhaps took for granted are actually being challenged in very unusual ways. The impact of that, as I said, 70% potentially international travel decline. You're looking at potentially, it says 900 million international tourist arrivals, which are down. So, really quite significant, potentially a billion tourist arrivals, and what we're looking like is probably $1 trillion in dollars in terms of revenue fall. So I've never seen, we've never seen graphs like this across the world. I was just having a little look through some of the tourism research just in recent months, and it's quite interesting. There's a little study, and I'll share the references and everything else. They've only done a few tourism interviews, so you can kind of take it with a pinch of salt, particularly this study. But I think what's interesting is this far-reaching impact. So a study by Yale in 2021 has really mapped out the relationships between tourism and COVID, but then this enormous impact that it's having right across, entertainment. You're talking about hospitality and events, obviously, in the next few weeks. Various different customer impacts, the impacts on forests, on oceans, on jobs, on beaches. Quite interesting, and where these kind of key areas are being discussed. Another nice little chart that they're talking about in this paper is really the kind of causality chart, these impacts. But things that you might not necessarily have thought about, but things like international disputes, you can see at the left-hand corner, it wasn't, depending on where your political allegiances are, but I'm sure you say it wasn't particularly helpful for Trump, for example, to be kind of calling it, this kind of China disease or everything else. So actually, yes, you can look at the economic impact of reduction in tourists, but actually there is quite a number of different unintended consequences. Social, cultural discrimination in terms of some of this work, some of the social distancing impacts that has caused, massive unemployment, massive stagnation. So where has this been felt most acutely? Yes, it is a global area, but actually, I think there is potential for inclusive, sustainable growth. One of the countries, this is my own photo, so I am guilty of a long-haul travel a few years ago for my own honeymoon to the Maldives. The Maldives is probably the top of the list in terms of one of the countries most reliant on tourism, that's pretty much built on tourism. And what was interesting, I was looking at some of the kind of the impacts, because they needed to respond very, very quickly, and looking at the World Bank really being able to kind of give it, I think, 7.3 million quite a number of jobs, almost 40% of jobs relying on tourism. But it had always suffered from how do we balance tourism and actually the impact on our very fragile infrastructure? And I think it's time to kind of step back and think how we're responding to this. I'm fortunate, I have a new industry mentor. So my new industry mentor is Harriet Green. She pops up on Question Time sometimes, and she was the CEO of Asia Pacific IBM, so a really big industry hitter. Although not in tourism, we had a conversation about, how do we respond to this vortex of change, not just COVID, but climate change, this and the growth of AI, digital tech, and also something that's close to my heart because I'm inclusive education lead at King's, equality, diversity, the Black Lives Matter movement. All of these things we need to consider in the tourism industry. It is very easy to be blindsided by the impact of COVID, but how are we responding? How are you responding as future graduates in this space? So I guess that leads to, secondly, how might this change tourism for the better? And I love, this kind of quote from Bruce Poon, who you were an entrepreneur, you should be aware. I'm just trying to think of his big company, Gap Adventures. Pauses us to give the gift of time to consider how we can travel more consciously. And it's that idea of thinking about different forms of tourism, that catalyst for change. People have rethought, reviewed actually the kind of spaces and places that they want to occupy. And this is where the opportunity for smaller businesses, smaller places, less trodden paths can have an opportunity to really come forward, because people are kind of feeling actually that mass tourism opportunity is not safe and is not really appropriate for that vortex of change that I've mentioned. It's interesting, we've seen things like the petrol crisis, which have really kind of questioned, I think, our reliance on, in gas and fuels. So this idea of how do we shift from a quality into a kind of quantity into a quality perspective. So it's quality over quantity. And I was loving seeing some of the scenes, I'm sure you've seen it, things like South Africa's wildlife parks, some of the animals just being able to be undisturbed for nature to reset itself. So Nigel Morgan, years ago, and if you haven't read his stuff, Nigel Morgan's such a lovely guy. Tomorrow's successful destinations, be places that engage with issues of social responsibility, ethical practice, sustainable ways. This is as true now, more than ever, actually, in terms of going forward. So you can see the little lions and everything else, and I've given you a couple of little reads there, but some of the benefits that the tourism industry can kind of go forward. There are two things I think that we can think of to build that better. And this is idea of, when you look at the UNWTO work, how can we build better? And I would argue that you always see in history two things: innovation-led growth and purpose-led orientation and purpose-led growth. Something with a mission, something with a vision that actually aligns to sustainability. So let me give you an example. When we had previous financial crises, the innovation came from people or organisations like Apple, for example, with their iPods and everything else. How do we replicate that in tourism? A lovely list of the world's most innovative companies 2021 has fantastic examples of this. One being Intrepid, two being Hopper, which is I'm yet to use, but apparently it's very, very good in terms of actually being able to do price prediction algorithms. And what's really interesting about Hopper, and if you look at their jobs, actually it's all about software engineers, digital AI, these kind of areas that perhaps are not actually on our tourism curriculum, and perhaps they should be going forward. Intrepid have got some fantastic things, various different partnerships with carbon disclosure. They do science-based targets. They're working with the UN Global Compact, a really nice example, Australia-based innovation. So thirdly, as I kind of wind down my kind of 20 minutes, I did want to say, so what does this all mean for you as students, as future graduates, in terms of being the future tourism industry leaders? Because it could be rather gloomy when you look at jobs at risk. I think we've seen, mass unemployment. Reskilling is going to be key, but you'll see some of the areas that we've seen have been, desperately impacted in terms of job losses. So I had a little look. If you haven't seen it before, McKinsey is a fantastic source in terms of really thinking about future careers. And there's probably 3 criteria, regardless of the sector, but it particularly I think is prominent for tourism. And this kind of lines back with this idea of innovation growth and purpose-led growth. You know, if you've got something that actually is I think aligned to social justice, that's going to make a difference for the world, and increasingly you're seeing that tourists are willing to pay more for that, knowing that actually they're not having the same kind of negative impact on their environment. So thinking about what you could do, you know, adding value beyond what can be done by automated systems. You know, we all say, oh, my job's going to be taken over by a robot. Well, that's not necessarily true. If you can add actually value beyond that kind of digital world. Digital skills are going to be absolutely key, you know, operating in a digital environment. How do you use data to make decisions? How do you understand data? So you don't necessarily need to be a software engineer, but actually it's going to be increasingly important that you can interpret data and you can use that data. And obviously, thirdly, continuing to adapt to different working environments, being able to change, being able to kind of be quite pragmatic about where you're headed. I'm taking this out of our book. I won't necessarily go through it, but what's interesting is, you know, I presented this employability compass. Where do you develop these skills in your career, in your curriculum, in your extracurricular activities, in terms of self-efficacy, confidence, resilience, industry knowledge, workplace skills? If you're able to kind of say, yeah, actually, I can see where all these things are being developed, then you are in a position to prepare for tomorrow, as I've quoted there. You know, the UNWTA have said we must invest in human capital and talent development, and this is where I see the future, and particularly you. And it kind of aligns nicely with the World Economic Forum skills. So 2015, they listed the top 10 skills that they would want to see in the workplace. And then 2020, you'll see there complex problem solving, critical thinking, creativity, and so forth. But it's really interesting when you start seeing things like emotional intelligence coming, you know, beyond and before some of the more hard skills that we might have said before. So how do you add value? 4 things: resilience, dealing with change. You know, how adaptable are you? I think the tourism industry has had to adapt probably more than any other industry in the last couple of years, and actually they're the ones that will survive in terms of actually that adaptation. How do you build yourself a cultural competency in terms of a global mindset? And, you know, I think you have a very diverse student group, but how are you working with international companies? How are you understanding the different impact that the crisis has had, you know, in terms of sometimes the way that it's been appalling, that, you know, in terms of how China has been seen in this in its role or not in COVID. Sustainability is absolutely key. All the employers, you know, I speak to have addressed that, and how you really are up to date with how AI might work, your digital literacy, how machine learning is working, that this is going to be the future, and looking at all the various jobs in tourism. So finally, what can be done? You know, we need to be rebuilding tourism, obviously, but we need to build back better. We need a sector that is far more sustainable, far more resilient, and is purpose-led, doing a much, I suppose, kind of more positive role in terms of actually environmental, economic, and cultural sustainability. So in terms of policy, you know, some of the questions I suppose we might want to ask ourselves, that we might want to think about, is how might we restore traveller confidence? You know, it has been knocked in so many different ways, and now we're seeing, for example, hotels, and when you're looking at hospitality, but actually putting in place measures that might cost more, but people are more willing to do that because they are more confident that it's safer for them. How might we support tourism businesses to adapt and survive? I'm sure we'll hear, you know, how tricky it has been, particularly at a local level in a minute. This idea of domestic tourism and safe return of international, I think a lot of people have discovered the UK, particularly if you're in the UK, and they've, you know, so many people travel down to Cornwall and Scotland and everything else, but then that has an impact in terms of the infrastructure. Information, I teach a lot of marketing. You know, how do we actually provide the kind of information that limits uncertainty, thinking about how we respond to kind of looking at the kind of capacity. And also, I think this partnership is going to be key. How do we develop partnerships with all those different stakeholders that I showed you in that previous graph, that actually together and with cooperation we can become more resilient going forward. So probably on that, there's a few bits and pieces that I've left, but I will probably stop there, which is about 20 minutes or so, isn't it? So I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Sally. That was very insightful. I'm sure we will have quite a few questions for you at the end.
No problem. That's fine.
Next, we have Miriam Constantinou. Miriam, if you want to go ahead.
Hi everyone. So a little bit about myself. I've worked in Cambridge, probably central Cambridge, for around 13 years. So I've adapted from hospitality, from retail, and now obviously the sort of more punting tourism sector. So I have a good awareness of how Cambridge has really been over the years. For us, obviously tourism was a massive chunk of our income for lots of local businesses. Obviously, you know, during the summer was the height of it all, but also during kind of the winter months. So you'd have people internationally traveling all year round, depending on holidays from abroad, and when their seasonal holidays are from different countries. So for us, it was very much we could rely on that through kind of the lower months, in which with the British economy would maybe be a bit quieter. So as you see after Christmas and things like that. So Cambridge has always been a hotspot. You've got the colleges, you've got the river, you've got the key areas. So for that, we've always been a very kind of strong sector for tourism. I've worked as a brand general manager for Ruthford's for around 2 years now. So I actually started just before the pandemic hit. So for me, obviously, I took my knowledge from management, but also from working locally in Cambridge, to kind of like take on board a little bit more of a element of how can we make Ruthford's better as such. So for us, our business model was very much experience led. So with tourism, it was very much a quick sale. So you'd always have a lot of people out and about. Punting in Cambridge, I know probably everyone's aware of it. It's very much known. So you see key areas of the city you wouldn't from the street. So for people that were coming from abroad, it was very much a key opportunity to take those, you know, those pictures for Kings, some of the kind of key images that people see socially around the world, and that can represent our city basically. So from that, obviously with COVID, it came a lot more of a tricky element for us. I'd probably say the biggest challenges that we've experienced is that for our line of work, our season is a lot shorter. So usually in punting, obviously summer is very, very busy. It can get very chaotic down near the river. But for us, prior to COVID, we still had quite strong work within the lower months. So once obviously people go back from summer holidays, you still got autumn, winter and spring. But with tourism, we had that stability to be able to bring customers on all time of year. So obviously Chinese New Year used to be a great one for us. We used to have a lot of people come, and that was great because we were still able to operate functionally and have really good sort of outcome from that. Since obviously that's happened and we're more looking at the UK based, I think that's been one of the biggest challenges this year, is that we need to maximise the very small amount of time we have. Especially with weather and everything like that. Us Brits, we love it when it's sunny. So that obviously can go 360 very quickly for us. So with the kind of more British market, it very much is weather dependent, and that's how our bookings were. Another one of our biggest challenges was actually social distancing and isolation. So for us, that was staff as well as customers. Obviously with the restrictions we have from the government, if you had symptoms or anything like that, there was that isolation period, which was obviously for health and safety reasons needed. But as a business point of view, was very challenging to adapt with. For us, obviously, if customers had bookings, we had to adapt to our terms and conditions, the refunds, just to make it easy for us to manage with the ongoing issues of customers maybe calling in, but also staffing as well. So from a business point of view, that was very much a difficult challenge that we had. Again, with social distancing, a little bit about how our tours work. We have obviously private tours, which is a boat to yourself, which is perfect because, again, that's social distancing. However, for people that are looking for maybe a cheaper way of looking at the sites in the river, we do shared tours, which previously were bums on seats. People were sitting next to each other. And it was very easy to work with because you'd just literally be booking a seat. Where with social distancing in place, we had to adapt to doing a row. So people had that space between everyone. So for us, we had to really kind of change our way of selling our tickets. So looking at budgeting, looking at profitability, but also looking at health and safety of our customers. So we had to kind of change that up very, very quickly. How we adapted, we mainly adapted with obviously making sure that everyone is sort of health and safety is paramount. Reassuring the customers, that was very important. And I think as a business, a lot of tourism has to deal with in regards to making sure that customers know that with COVID restrictions, that we are obviously playing by the rules, but also reassuring the customer to come and visit us, because I think a lot of people were very nervous at first. And that's understandable. So for us, we had to really make sure that that was kind of spoken about quite highly on our social channels, on our website, on our emails, just keeping that communication open for all of us, really. With us, we really had to look at what we were offering the customer. So we had to ask what was our target audience now that we're in COVID times? How can we make that experience the best it possibly can and maximise on profit? So for us as a company, we were quite lucky because we'd had this idea prior to COVID that we wanted to be more of an experience-led brand. So in regards to celebrations, birthdays, proposals, anything in which it was a little bit more of a step up. So we thought about this prior to COVID. We had the sort of stepping stones, but we really needed to kind of drive forward that idea. And I think during lockdown, that was pretty much my kind of avenue in regards to kind of prepping for opening. What could we do to make people want to come with us, basically? So with us, we were looking at people that wanted to celebrate birthdays, people that wanted an anniversary. So for us, by doing that, we worked with partnerships. So again, this was a great adaptation tool, and it maximised our exposure as well as obviously really helping out local businesses. So the great thing about Cambridge is we've got some really great local independents that are have got very high quality produce, or cafes or hotels, which really offer, you know, an experience in Cambridge. So for us, we wanted to really support those brands, and I think it's very important this year that everyone supported each other. And I think that's been one of the most positive elements of this pandemic, is you've seen a lot of companies around Cambridge which might not have spoken to one another prior to the pandemic, really reaching out and supporting one another, which has been the key to kind of keeping us going, basically, whether that is through social channels, whether that is through helping out from a B2B point of view, or whether that's just being kind of a friendly face and being able to kind of go, oh, how are you doing? What are you doing? That helps. So for us, that really helped us this year. We grew some really strong partnerships with the gin distillery, Fitzbilly's, which is a local cafe, local hotels, really kind of jumping on the back of their best product and making our product better. So for example, this year we created a gin experience. So on the river, you get to learn how to make gin. So it had a great element of fun. So the customers were looking for something a little bit different. But it was something that we could really play around with this year, comparable to last. This year we had the time to develop the product. We had the customers willing to come, and we had the kind of time to really invest in that. So positively, I think that was one of the best things that came out of this pandemic, was adapting to being able to support local businesses and where we could lean on each other and support in this kind of very uncertain year. Also, marketing and social presence has been a lot more of an important structure for us as a company. So in regards to kind of reaching out locally, but also further afield, showing what we're about, mainly just asking the question what punting is, just to the local community, because I think for us, you know, being local to Cambridge, maybe Canterbury and Oxford all have that knowledge of what punting is, but for people that may live further afield, that don't have access to the river or anything like that, punting is not very well known. So I think for us to really outreach at the strongest possibility, we had to make sure that our social channels were focused on, and marketing was really paramount. So for us, that was again very important for us to adapt. Also, I think online trade. So sort of a bit what with Sally mentioning with digital age, with us saying 3 years ago, our street trade, which is basically when customers come up to our station and book at that point, was 80%. Our online trade was around 20%. It's kind of turned the opposite way around. So this year, our online trade is around 70%. So it was really making sure that your online presence is the strongest it possibly can be. People want to pre-book things nowadays. So for example, you know, restaurants and things like that, you want the reassurance that when you get there, you have availability, but also it's making you want to look forward to things. I think what's come out of the pandemic is all of us are very looking forward to going out and enjoying ourselves. So in that terms, our online bookings have been very, very strong. And I think that is something that I think most businesses have had to adapt to, whether that is a quicker service, more exposure on Google, more exposure on TripAdvisor, any sort of element that you could think of, I think is very key, because if it's word of mouth, is sometimes, even though it's strong, it's not strong enough. You have to be that searchable brand or business to be able to survive. Looking into the future, I think, you know, again, relaying what Sally said is regards to kind of normality, that's probably not going to be normal until 2023, I would probably suggest. And even that's probably not going to be what it was previously. I think what is important is really knowing what your brand is and running with it. So making sure your exposure is key, what point of difference you are, what makes you stand out from the crowd, basically. Because at the moment, obviously, it's very much we have a smaller audience, but making that quality over quantity is what's really, really helped us this year. So, for example, we've done proposal tours, which has been amazing. We've done around, I think, 24 this year, and a lot of them have been through word of mouth. And so I think the quality and what you deliver is the highest it needs to be. I think a lot of tourism and hospitality in previous years has been susceptible to being, it's so busy that you're just kind of, you know, thankful for the income, and you kind of take for granted the quality of service you provide. So I think this year has definitely taught a lot of companies that you have to give quality and a point of difference to really make it. And also just kind of supporting other brands. I think, you know, going forward, that's something that we're really looking forward to sort of producing a little bit more in lower months when we have time, but really supporting other local businesses, I think, is the key for tourism industry to really kind of help each other out, whether that's sort of seeping into hospitality, retail, or other public sectors. I think this year has definitely highlighted that. I think going forward, that's the best point of call. So yeah, summary wise, I think it's about adapting with the times, supporting local businesses where you can, having a lasting positive effect on your brand and on people's experiences, and making sure that's high priority, whether that's through staff training or through every step of the way from the booking process to kind of the left as such, when they've left and they want to kind of like recommend us on TripAdvisor. And lastly, I think the only thing I would say is budgeting from a business point of view. Spend wisely. Make sure you're spending in the right sectors. So high quality staffing, the right marketing. It doesn't have to cost a lot. It can be through social. But from us, from a punting point of view, because our year is a lot shorter, we have to make sure that what we have goes a long way. So yeah, I mean, I don't know how long I've spoken about. I don't know if I've gone over 20 or not even past 15, but yeah.
That's fine, don't worry, you're good. Thank you very much.
No problem.
I can imagine it has been quite a change for the business. You did a lot with the lockdown.
Yes. It's been a challenging thing, but also quite rewarding. I think it's a lot of local Cambridge businesses have learned a lot, and I think it's going to come up back stronger, which is good. I think what Sally was saying is we can definitely learn a lot from this experience.
Definitely. So thank you very much. So now it is time for everyone to please write your questions for both Sally and Miriam, or both. You can write them down in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we will let you talk.
I actually have a question I'd like to ask if possible. Well, first of all, there's a lot of questions that I'd like to ask, and I feel like 20 minutes just isn't enough to go over them. So I'll be contacting you both to ask you questions personally that I've come up with. But one I'd like to ask Miriam is that sort of before the pandemic, I'm quite familiar with punting. I know that like brand partnerships and partnerships with local businesses wasn't such a huge thing. Do you think that's proven to be quite successful or quite valuable throughout the pandemic with regards to helping not only your business, but the other businesses as well? Do you feel like it's been a positive response from them through what they've got through you, as well as vice versa?
Absolutely. I think it works positively for both us and the brands involved. I think the common issue that we've all had is that sort of being scared that things will not be as successful and lose money on businesses. And from the target audience that we've now got, which is the staycation customers, they're looking for something that's slightly different. They're wanting the hidden gems. They're wanting the best of. And I think, for example, the Gin Lab, it's an experience that maybe not everyone is familiar with, but when people are looking for something slightly different, they come and it's an exciting thing to do, which is not normal, basically. It's really helped from an exposure point of view more than we actually realised. Just for example, social. So from an exposure point of view, punting wise is not very well known, but gin is very well known. So it's getting those kind of audiences that you might not have been able to prior. And so that's been really, really good for us because it's made a point of difference for our customers, but also it's brought new customers in. And it's marrying up what people like as well. People always have these ideas of what they really, really like, but in the back of their head, punting is probably not one of them. So if we can get to a place where, someone that's really liking a cream tea experience, but never thought about having it on the river, that's been really, really handy for us. And it's also just good because we've seen that they will equally support us just as much as we do. So it's really great to be able to do that because that they're having, more people ordering through us, which means obviously they've got a higher revenue, and we're having booked tours because people are interested in that sort of avenue of trying maybe that cream tea experience. So I think helping out other businesses has really proven successful this year.
That's great.
Yes, Christina.
Hello, everyone. Just want to say thank you to the guest speakers. You were amazing, and it's nice to see you again, Sally. it was very insightful, and I'm glad that you guys made it possible to have both an educational and a professional perspective on what happened. I have a question regarding the early stages of COVID. So when things started, let's say, crumbling, what was your first reaction, and when did you start seeing a bit of a downfall? Because I think that the travel industry was one of the first to get hit.
Shall I go first?
Yeah, go first.
Yeah, of course. I mean, for us, I think that the early stages were probably, like most people, the most nerve-wracking, especially with people refunding, people that were sort of very uneasy in regards to the restrictions lifting. There was a lot of nervousness in everyone's sector in regards to not wanting to venture out past their local village. So for us, that was the most worrying point, I think. It was quite handy, the time of year, that everything started lifting again. And I think with the government scheme of Eat Out and Help Out, that really helped. And obviously, you know, we were going into the summertime. So for us, you know, we were very lucky. I think if we'd come out of lockdown, businesses were open and it was winter, it would probably would have been a different story. But it definitely was a nerve-wracking element to us. You kind of just have to put the brakes on in regards to kind of like the operational side of things, but really kind of have that mentality. You have to look forward. So you have to look at seeing what you can do when things open again to be ready for it. So we were still very busy in lockdown. It's just you had to kind of have the confidence that things were going to get better. And as I said, be very wise of where you spend your money as well.
I suppose if I can come in with the global impact in terms of tourism, I mean, it's interesting, even in the universities, December 2020, it feels like a long time ago now, a lot of people were like, yeah, it's just the flu, don't kind of worry about it, it's fine, you know, we'll just kind of work through it. And then January, it was kind of, oh, hang on a second, there are people, you remember the cruise ship that was, you know, that was kind of suddenly the cases started rising and people were going, oh, hang on a second, there was a concern here. You know, Japan was looking at locking down, and then you had the first case where an individual died in February, and then you started seeing different countries locking down. New Zealand was obviously the classic example of where it went kind of, and then we obviously went into lockdown in March. So there was a kind of a very slow ripple effect, and then suddenly this tornado of activity that happened at a global sense. And as soon as you start having countries that are locking down, that are essentially quarantining visitors, that is alarming. And then you see the rest. So I think there was a kind of denial, and then suddenly it took the kind of geopolitical environment to really kind of force people to take this extremely serious. And then, you know, I have to say myself, I had a trip planned to Spain, and, you know, I was cancelling, and then it was suddenly, as Miriam was saying, just cancellations all over the place, and the tourism industry was not prepared for that. And I think what it highlighted were a number of cracks in the system. You know, it's interesting we talk about digital. You know, the systems weren't in a fit state to be able to deal with that kind of disruption. If you're thinking much of the tourism is happening in lesser developed countries, you know, in emerging countries, that was where it hit most strongly, and yet that's where the systems are probably most fragile. And so, you know, that was a significant situation, and obviously then you start seeing it kind of tumble from there. But yeah, a significant one. And it's lovely to see you as well, Christina. I'm recognising faces, which is great, because I only left 3 years ago. So, and I love the fact that Miriam talks about food, because, you know, my passion is food, and partnerships with food and drink companies are absolutely essential, I think, in terms of sustainability, in terms of really having that kind of innovation-led growth, because it's you know, that's where we see a lot of the innovation coming through. So I'm delighted that those partnerships are working, and at a global level, country partnerships are coming into place now. It's really interesting. There's so many parallels between the local and the really kind of massive macro level, you know, partnerships, and that's what the UN, you know, WTO are seeing. Cooperation between countries, absolutely key now.
Yes, Zach?
Sorry, just to literally piggyback off that point, you mentioned about like how partnerships are so crucial in coming into play to help sort of like reboost the economy and business revenue. I can see how it can work like on a national level, how brands and businesses can cooperate. However, on an international scale, you know, for some countries, there are a whole set of rules and regulations that apply. And then in another country, there's a completely different set of rules and regulations. How easy is it moving forward for countries internationally to be able to cooperate, more or less?
Yeah, I mean, it probably is on several layers, isn't it? I mean, there's economic cooperation in terms of formal partnerships that you're talking about in terms of movement. But, you know, I think actually there is a social and moral responsibility, particularly of the Western countries, the more established countries, to actually dive in and help those that are really suffering, you know, in terms of many of those developing countries. So you'll see Thailand and Maldives, and those have been most affected, both in terms of not just kind of being a route for tourists from the West, but actually in terms of offering support in terms of infrastructure, digital technology, ideas, rebuilding. You see it. I mean, it's not new. You've seen it in similar kind of areas, particularly where things like earthquakes and tsunamis and things have helped. And I think this is where actually there is a moral responsibility to have that cooperation. I suppose then you've got, aside from that, when things begin to start opening, actually the kind of less competitive in nature, but actually working at building schedules that actually draw on a number of different countries in a tourism offer. And I think, much like actually Miriam was saying, sometimes rather than actually kind of seeing all these different companies as kind of siloed, separate entities, what you're beginning to see is actually, okay, how might we offer, I don't know, a Scandinavian experience? How might we offer an experience through the cruise companies or through the kind of slow tourism offerings that actually draw a number of different countries together that are in a similar place, you know, in terms of their vaccination levels and you know, the COVID cases and everything else. So I think you can take what Miriam was saying and actually really kind of build that across appropriate borders, but it's going to take time. You know, it will take time. But I think there's more to be gained for working actually together and sharing knowledge and skills than there is independently and separately.
We have another question from Andy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for participating in this event, Sally and Miriam. It's a pleasure to have you on board. So in terms, as Sally was talking before about environmental and all of those things related, so I would like to ask to both, how do you think that this is the right moment to update the politics concerning waste footprint? Because as we saw before, as long as everyone stop, so the level of footprint in the planet, they decrease a little bit.
Do you want to go, Miriam?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for us, it's always been a sort of very important factor, you know, like distribution of waste. And I think, you know, we had that point last year where we were seeing a positive impact on the environment in regards to slowing down, not using, you know, aeroplanes as such and travel. To now you see a lot of people using disposable masks and things like that. And it can be quite hard to kind of morally keep on the straight and narrow in regards to knowing that you're going to be positively impacting. I mean, for us, we're always thinking about new ways to help. We, you know, make sure there's a recycling bag near our station, because a lot of people obviously go onto our boats with, you know, wine and things like that, and disposal of rubbish. You know, it's finding that slight tweak of how you can help, you know, towards that, and whether that's kind of rubbish disposal, whether that's using different materials. I mean, for us, Punting, from just that point of view, you know, we're quite lucky in regards to, you know, we're not using any kind of form of transportation that has sort of that element of damage. I think for us, the only thing that we've changed this year, like for example, we now offer refreshments to our customers as an add-on. And again, that was an adaptation of kind of trying to improve our service and making it a slight point of difference from our competitors and for the staycation customer. And we wanted to make sure that for us, we wanted to deliver that on a bike, because again, we didn't want that cause of damage to the environment, but also we wanted to support local through British produce, and that obviously has a bigger impact in regards to transportation and from an environmental point of view, that obviously the chain of it coming to us is a lot shorter, and we're always trying to be very looking for new ways to improve. And I think it's important because, as you said, like, we've had this chance to be able to kind of look at ourselves and go, what can we do to help? Because it's been a slower pace. I think it's important that we go forward with that.
Yeah, I think, I think we both said it, actually. It was this quality over quantity. And I think that is going to be absolutely key in terms of this particular area. So I just say three things. I would say one is going to be, it has been key, is education. And I mean education of local people, but also of tourists. And I think there's nothing more striking, and that we learn more when it's literally a crisis is in our face. And I think what is it's shown us in terms of the impact that we have had, our previous footprint, compared to somewhere where we just remove ourselves from all those idyllic, pristine islands and everything else, and suddenly you're seeing flora and fauna rejuvenate. And I think being able to do that, I mean, I mentioned the Maldives earlier, and I've got a student that's involved in a project over there where it's actually almost showing locals the impact of tossing stuff into the ocean, because actually a lot of local people can't swim. I mean, it's crazy, and they don't see the bleaching, they don't see the impacts, but actually a number of local community projects are kind of helping them swim, and then they are able to see the impact of some of this business. It's quite a really interesting kind of project. Second one is technology. I mentioned, you all are going to be at the forefront of technology in terms of AI, in terms of digital, in terms of machine learning. And actually, the move to electric vehicles, the move to alternative sources of fuel and better waste disposal that's not burning and things like that, actually that's coming down the line. So I think the tourism industry probably need to be ahead of this, the third largest industry in normal times. And the third one is building our domestic tourism and exactly what Miriam was outlining. I think people have suddenly discovered actually we live in quite a nice country. If you're talking about kind of local, and I've had that so many times. Oh, actually, we've gone down to Devon, and actually it's quite nice, but it's had a bad rap. And I think Brand UK or UK PLC, as people say, actually there has been an opportunity to say, actually we've got significant offering that can be reached very easily through more slow tourism or travel methods, train, bike, and everything else. There's a bit of work to do, because it's I spoke to someone the other day, and it was cheaper for them to actually go overseas for a week than it was to stay at an Airbnb in Wales. So we haven't quite got that nailed out, but I can see there are green shoots and potentially of changing that kind of footprint that we have.
Okay, thank you. So that is all the time we have for questions today. So if you guys have any other questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can send it to us through our social media, which is at The Awareness Event. We would also really appreciate if you could take 2 minutes just to fill our SurveyMonkey link to give us some constructive feedback. We would really appreciate it. So thank you again, of course, to both Professor Sally Everett and Miriam Constantinou for giving us their time and such great insight into the tourism industry at this very moment. I am sure that you have found it as helpful as we did. So thank you both.
Absolute pleasure. Yeah, and well done for putting this event together. I'm sorry, because I think we can't see the chat at all. So if there are questions, then please pass them on, and I'd be happy to, because on my slides there's a few references and think might be useful. I'll throw them over to maybe Nikki, who can kind of share those as well.
For sure. Yes, so thank you very much, and also to everyone for attending. Next week, we will be discussing hospitality and the challenges the industry faced this past almost 2 years, as well as how do we see its recovery and evolution. We hope you join us again next week on Wednesday at 5 p.m. And if you could give us a follow on Instagram and LinkedIn to keep updated, that would be great. Again, the link for our survey for feedback is in the chat. If you guys cannot access this for whatever reason, please let us know. We can send it to you directly. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Well done. Thank you,
you.
Sally
Thank
and
you,
Miriam.
everyone.